Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second Startup Global webinar of 2026, Building Global Relationships, Cultural Intelligence for Market Success. My name is Amanda Logan, Programs Officer for Startup Global at Startup Canada. To begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which I am today, and it is located on the unceded and traditional territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe, also known as Ottawa. As we are a national organization, I would also like to acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of all Indigenous peoples. I encourage you to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territory you are residing on today. We invite each of our attendees to introduce themselves and connect with each other in the chat. Make sure you are sending your messages to everyone in the room. You are welcome to share your LinkedIn or business social media pages, but please note in no way are you obligated to share any personal contact information. Please only share information that you are comfortable with being public. So a bit about Startup Canada. Startup Canada is a national nonprofit that is the gateway to Canada's entrepreneurial ecosystem. We're here to connect entrepreneurs with the support, community, and tools they need to build a successful business in Canada. Startup Global is one of Startup Canada's flagship programs that supports entrepreneurs looking to export and expand their businesses internationally. From webinars, roundtables, and our annual pitch competition, this free program will help you build an international market entry strategy and plan. I would like to take a moment to thank our co-presenting partners, UPS and Export Development Canada, also known as EDC, as well as our ecosystem partner, Forum for International Trade Training, known as FIT, and our community partners, GS1, Communitech, and WBC. Now we have a quick video from our partners at UPS on how they can support Canadian small businesses and entrepreneurs. Wonderful. Thank you again, UPS. So today's conversation is focused on cultural intelligence, how cultural norms, values, and communication styles can shape global business interactions, and how Canadian entrepreneurs can build trust and meaningful relationships when expanding into international markets. We have prepared questions for our panelists. However, if you do have a question, you can write it into the Q&A box on the bottom function of the bar on your screen. We will do our best to have it answered live. Now, without further ado, I'm honored to introduce our speakers today. First, we have Laura Vergudo. She is our moderator for today, so I'll be passing the mic over to Laura very shortly. Laura is the Partnerships and Community Lead for Forum for International Trade Training, FIT, one of our lovely ecosystem partners. Also joining us today are our panelists. So our panelists include Peter Pierce Eliosia, founder and CEO of Digi Millennials. Welcome, Peter. We have Neha Berry, Director of Global Partnership Bureau with Wellington Advocacy. Hi, Neha. And Danny Leschner, Business Development Director from Clifo. Danny is calling in from Germany, so thank you so much, Danny. Okay, it is time for our moderated discussion now. As I said, please introduce yourself in the chat if you feel comfortable. Write some questions for our panelists in the Q&A box. And Laura, I will pass the mic over to you.
Thanks so much, Amanda, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I think to start off, I think it would be a great idea for our audience to get to know our speakers a little bit better. So I'll invite each of you to talk about your background, your organization. So Neha, let's start with you.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Startup Canada, for bringing us together today. My name is Neha. I support global partnerships at Wellington Advocacy, where I work with organizations and founders that are looking to scale their impact internationally. and build strategic relationships across markets. So a lot of our work focuses on helping Canadian organizations navigate complex global ecosystems. So whether that means engaging with governments or NGOs, multilateral institutions or industry, or local partners. I help leaders understand that international growth is not only about identifying a market opportunity, but it's also about understanding the relationships and institutions abroad. One of the biggest lessons that I've learned is that trust is the currency of international partnership. So your products, your technology, your service may open the door, but it's ultimately relationships that allow you to build something sustainable over time. It's so nice to be with all of you today.
I love that. Thank you. Peter, how about we go to you next?
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Happy to be here. My name is Peter Pierce-Elosia. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of a media publication called DigiMillennials Media Companies. Basically, what we do at DigiMillennials is to amplify African and African diaspora, through things like digital content, live experiences, community engagements. I'm also the founder of a festival called Afro Vibes Festival. It's one of the largest growing festivals in Ontario. It happens in Kitchener, Waterloo, which is the southern region of Ontario. I have over a decade of experience working across marketing, across media. I have a background working with global brands such as MTV, BET, Nickelodeon, Comedy Central, prior to coming into Canada. Prior to that, I also sit on several boards, so I'm happy to be here to share my experiences and just knowledge of, just kind of like building a relationship in the ecosystem or in the business. So thank you for having me.
I love it. Thank you, Peter. And Danny, if you could introduce yourself.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for the invitation. Really grateful to be here and to have these discussions. I lived in Germany since 2009, originally from Canada, the East Coast, from New Brunswick, and have worked in international environments since, forcefully, but happily, and I love it. I started in the pharmaceutical industry about 15 years ago, so I work with organizations who are looking to run clinical trials across the globe. So really large international teams, different cultures, different languages, and different time zones.
Excellent. I am so looking forward to this discussion. And I'm Laura Rigudo, as was mentioned by Amanda. I'm the Partnerships and Community Lead at FIT, Forum for International Trade Training. So for those of you that are not familiar, FIT is the leading provider of specific training dealing with getting your products or services across borders, as well as on the procurement side. So full scope international trade. And we also certify international trade professionals. I am a CITP myself, certified trade professional, and I see some other people in the audience that are CITPs. So FIT has the curriculum, that body of knowledge to help companies grow and scale and consider lots of factors, the A to Z of international trade. And cultural intelligence is one of those considerations that's sometimes overlooked. So I'm so happy to be here today moderating this panel, and hopefully we'll glean a lot of insights for you, because I know as part of the Startup Global program, there is a pitch competition. There are pop-up pitches and then the grand finale, and that is part of the Startup Global program. And what the judges look for is your global expansion plan, and how you plan to do that, and have you considered all factors in a market, and culture is part of that, because it does shape your market entry plan or your export plan, because knowing how to enter the market, who to form relationships with, how to work together and develop those. Culture is at the center of all of that. So super excited. I want to dive in, but just talking a little bit about culture, there are a lot of misconceptions. Often people think business culture, oh, that's just about how you exchange business cards. If you look at the business card before you shove it in your pocket, or if you bow, there's way more to business culture than just a business exchange or a gift exchange. I'm sure everyone's heard that. In certain markets, it's customary to bring a gift when you're meeting with a counterpart or a business partner that you're looking to develop a relationship with. Yes, those are all very important, but culture goes a lot deeper than that. So one of the misconceptions is to treat the country as a whole. So when they talk about maybe Japanese culture or European culture, I love that. There is no European culture. And Danny's shaking her head, and we're going to dive more into this. And even within, I'm looking at Danny, but looking at Germany, I'm sure there are multiple cultural aspects of play depending on where in Germany, or often thinking about the industry. So I know we'll talk about that. Danny's in pharmaceutical trials. So the industry itself, there's an industry culture. There's a regional culture, and then there's also organizational cultures. So like we're going to dive into all this, and I can give you tons of examples, but I don't want to do all the talking here. And another important aspect or misconception is that you just have to kind of, you read those commercial guides and you read a little bit about business culture without understanding really how each culture affects each element of your marketing mix. So when we're talking about sales and marketing, it's really important to understand the culture of the country, of the area you're going into, your industry, and the organizations that you're trying to forge relationships with, because how you enter into that market is affected by culture. How your product itself can be shaped by the culture, their preferences, their tastes, their beliefs, etc. And as well, how you promote your product. So all elements of the marketing mix and how you negotiate. Are you going into a high context society, a low context society? So there's just so much there. So why don't we start unpacking some of this? And I'm just going to start. I'm going to start with you, Neha. Many Canadian entrepreneurs approach international expansion with a strong focus on their product or solution. So, what do you think they often underestimate about relationship building when they're entering a new market?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing entrepreneurs underestimate in a relationship that they are not separate from the market entry, right? So they are the foundation of the market entry in my perspective. Often founders kind of arrive with a very clear understanding of their solution and their competitive advantage and their business case. And those things do matter. And obviously you do need to be an expert in that. But in many international markets, the first question people ask is not always, what does your product do? Sometimes they start with, who are you? What are you interested in our market? Do you understand our priorities? And are you here for a transaction or are you here for partnership? So I think building trust really does take time. Sometimes the first meeting is not about selling anything. It's about listening and learning and demonstrating that you respect the ecosystem that you're about to enter. My advice really is to founders is to spend as much time understanding the market as they spend time pitching into it. So identify who the trusted actors are, understanding local priorities, and obviously invest in the relationships before you need them. I think those are my main takeaways.
Excellent. Danny, how about we go to you next? How do you think that, what do you think that's often underestimated when you're building relationships when entering a new market?
I think making assumptions is a big one. So, specifically for if I'm thinking about the German market, there's a language barrier. When I laughed when you said Europe, because in Europe there are many countries, many languages, and with language comes culture. And it's a whole different way of communication that is the foundation for how you do business. And I would say never assume. So direct communication, forget idiosms, assume nobody is a native speaker, and just be clear with what you're trying to say, which is maybe different to more North American Canadian culture where we say things without saying things, and it's just uh, assumed that you know what is being said.
Exactly. And I always know one of the things that's the hardest to translate is humor. And that's often the last thing. So I lived overseas myself. I lived in Spain for a year. And I was the last person to laugh at a joke, and I pretended to laugh at jokes because I didn't get it, and I was fluent in Spanish, but I just couldn't get the jokes, and some of that slang just wasn't. So I think uh, businesses need to be really aware, like to avoid those little nuances and humor, because it's not always translated so well. Would you agree, Danny?
100%. And what could be perceived as rude in Canada as a direct communication is generally not perceived as rude in other countries, especially if we're considering Europe or other countries where people don't have English as a native language.
Right, right. Maybe before, because I wanted to ask you this, and I'm going to ask you now since you're talking about Germany, and then I'll go to you, Peter. I haven't forgotten. But I remember hearing a couple years ago that Germans find that note taking during a meeting is strange, because the idea is that the counterpart should be able to retain the information. Why are they writing it all down? And Canadians, I think, in general, we're aggressive note takers. I know when I'm in a meeting, I show that I'm engaged and I'm really listening to you by taking notes. But I heard, and I found this fascinating, that Germans find that it's not a sign of lack of intelligence, but it's kind of questionable why they would be jotting down so many notes instead of just retaining the information. Danny, can you comment on that?
I mean, that's funny. That's the first time I've ever heard that. And I've been here since 2009. So it's almost as long as I've lived in Canada. Yeah, I'm divulging my age slowly. But I would say I've never experienced it. And I think in the pharma space, it's a bit different because you're really working with numbers and
Right,
patients and real,
right.
um, I'm not saying that it's more important stuff than other industries, but it's numbers and it's patients and it's people.
Yes,
And so nobody's that smart.
right.
I would say it's more about clear communication. So setting the stage. So if I felt that that would be a concern, I would come in and tell them, hey, I'm just taking notes. It's not because I'm not listening. It's because I want to make sure that the information that I write down is correct and that we can really follow through at the end of the meeting to make sure that I captured everything, that I'm not forgetting something. So I think it comes back to that communication thing, and just setting the expectation that you're not trying to be rude, that this is a tool that you're using, and that it actually is, um, it should not be perceived as negative, so to say.
I love that. That's really good insights. And I think it goes back to one of my original comments, that you have to understand the culture of your industry, not just say, the culture in the country, but of your industry. And as you mentioned, highly, regulatory and scientific. And so I could see that, and organizational culture. So, well, I'm glad I asked you, because I
Yeah,
remember being very surprised about that.
that's funny. Now I'm going to pay extra attention to
Yes.
it.
Peter, how about we go to you? So, what do you think that is often underestimated about relationship building with the people, the organizations that you work with?
I think the biggest thing is the intentionality of it, right? Like for us personally, like the work that I really do is being able to, sorry, can you hear me properly? I know I saw a comment about my audio not being loud enough. Can you hear
It's
me?
better now, Peter. It's better now.
Perfect. So really more about the intentionality of kind of building those relationships, right? I think for us personally, the business that I do really focuses on bringing culture into Canada, right? So I'm from Nigeria by birth. I'm from Africa, right? And for me, it was really more about how do I sort of create a space, or how do we create a space that sort of welcomes like African diaspora into the audience, right? And for us to even be able to do that, it was us kind of even sampling. So to give an example, I'm a storyteller. Forgive me. I'm going to give a story. When we launched our festival in 2023, the people that we partnered with, they had done events in the region initially, right? But one thing that I noticed that there were not a lot of African experiences for like in the region itself, right? So for us, it was about how do we sort of intentionally bring our culture to them, right? In regards to maybe them sampling our food, them listening to the music that we kind of listen to, and just kind of creating a space, a welcoming space to build that relationship first intentionally, right? And that kind of pretty much is what set the stage for like the growth of the festival and everything else, right? So the biggest thing for us is really just kind of like how do we identify opportunities that we can be intentional about building these relationships.
Excellent. Excellent. Um, I'm just wondering, what about language? And I know we mentioned language before, but maybe if we could share some tips, best practices when you don't, let's say the language of the country that you're going into isn't your first language, or your counterpart English might not be their first language. So what practices help to ensure that you're truly understood, or that you understand your counterpart? Um, who would like to go first? Nika,
I'm
I
happy
see
to
you.
jump in. Yeah. I
Perfect.
think obviously using technology helps too. You know, like a lot of text messages I even send now are can be translated in real time in terms of talking with people that don't necessarily speak the language. Avoid overly technical, jargony words. Like this is probably the time to keep things simple. Try to summarize your points, but then also like confirm that they understand that too. I think that's super helpful. And then I would just say like pay attention to maybe what's not being said. So like obviously if they look confused or still unsure, you can usually tell without them saying, "Hey, I'm unclear about what you're saying." And just be comfortable in asking for clarity and understanding. So I think those are like the main things I would probably do if there's a language barrier.
Love that. Great points. Peter?
Yeah, I was going to jump into, and again, depending on the context, right? For me personally, I'm proud to come into Canada. Most of the relationships I built were virtually, or like, I mean, I use social media every other day, right? So there's like Neha mentioned, we have opportunities to translate conversations, right? So if you know that you are going into a market that you don't understand for using English, for example, and then maybe like there was a mention of Spain, right? So Spanish. If you want to break into a market, maybe engage with like somebody in Spain, you could really just go to Google Translate or the use of technology to be able to get those like text and conversate with people across different parts of the world, to be honest, using Translate. Copy and paste what you're saying, go back into the tool and have your conversation that way and build that relationship itself, right? So I think there are tools that enable us to be able to have those sort of global connections or like global conversations away from the language that we even know how to speak to, right?
Yeah, excellent. Danny?
Yeah, I would just add maybe stay curious. It sounds so simple, but actually, curiosity is what builds cultural awareness, because when you want to learn about the other person and why they're saying things certain way, it helps you give insight on why they might be questioning you a certain way, or why they might be speaking with you. So language, basic words is one thing, but culture and how you express yourself are a whole different thing. So I would say stay curious and ask questions. If you're not sure, just repeat and say, "Have I understood this correctly? You want 5 patients in your trial in country A, B, C, D." But curiosity at the base of it.
I love that. I love that. That's very good. I mean, with AI now, Google Translate, it's like a game changer. I wish I had that 30 years ago. Would have helped with my anxiety. But I found that just even recently, I spoke at a trade show, and there was a large delegation from Portugal. And I was speaking with somebody, and we agreed to continue the conversation. And she kept apologizing for her English, and she said, I'm much better writing. And I get that because then you probably can put it through a Google Translate or whatever AI. So she, but she was apologizing, and I said, don't apologize. Like, it's okay. So I find that my own, like working in global business a lot, and especially with Latin American countries, I started years ago with the government of Chile. I find that when you show your human side, and if English isn't your first language, and I find that business people will often apologize for their accent or, oh, my English isn't very good. And I feel like that just breaks the tension, just removes those barriers. Nobody's perfect. Should be expecting perfection when working with another language, a second language, a third language. I'm always amazed at global business professionals often speak like three, four, five languages. And when in Europe, since we're talking about Europe, like so many languages, and I feel almost embarrassed because some of them speak, you know, four or five languages fluently. So, but where you are, like, I think you just have to be comfortable saying, can we conduct this meeting in English? My German or my whatever is not very good, and we're all human. So, and if somebody needs to see it in writing, that's completely fine. I understand. Yeah, very good. What about, so I think, Nika, you mentioned also, I think I heard body language or what's not being said. So is there something, that we can think of like nonverbal communication? That's It's so important, right? This nonverbal communication. Anybody have a story maybe that they'd like to add or?
I'm happy to just add a point to this, but I think the main takeaway from nonverbal communication is to not assume. I think, sometimes when you're interpreting someone's reaction to you, you might assume something from that interaction. And I've been through these many examples of times in which I walked away feeling like that person did not like what I was saying or was not interested in what I was saying. And then, follow up, they were like, we loved everything you said. This was exactly what we were looking for. So I think it's like sometimes we just perceive maybe like lack of over emoting or whatever kind of gestures we look for as people sometimes as like comfort or acknowledgement. Sometimes people are just a little bit more stoic, and that's fine too. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't agree or understand what you're trying to say. It just might mean that they are maybe taking a moment or pausing. But again, I realized that it was my own interpretation that I took on too quickly earlier in my career, that I realized, that that's something that I put on myself, and it doesn't in fact always mean that they're disinterested. So I think that's one of the main ways we should help kind of understand nonverbal cues.
I love that. I love that. And even interpreting, like, head shakes. Like, are they agreeing with you, disagreeing with you? What does that mean? But I want to back it up a little bit further. I'm thinking when you first greet someone, and in North America, we're used to extending our hand. And I remember when I first started working with Chile and, Latin America, it's like two kisses, like a kiss on each cheek. And in a business, and I grew up, my background is Italian, so I'm used to that in social settings, but I was not used to that in business settings. So it was like it presented like very awkward moments initially. And I think for women, you should be, pay particular attention to that. And so what I started to do when I would meet an acquaintance, a business acquaintance for the first time, I mean, it may have been perceived to be cold or rude, but I would kind of step back and extend my hand so that there was no misinterpreting that, this was my handshake. This is how we were going to greet each other. So that was just my tip because I just didn't want those awkward moments because we're not used to greeting someone like that. Danny and Peter, did you want to mention anything about nonverbal communication?
Yeah, I think it goes back to your point of being human. I think, speaking about what you're doing has a lot of weight. So I often say, like, I'm sorry, I'm Canadian and German is not my native language. So actually communicating that, I don't know if it's setting up the stage in a good or positive way, but saying, like, oh, I'm just shaking your hand because in Canada, this is how we greet people. Um, it's just raising awareness to your humanity and just showing them you're not trying to be disrespectful. This is what you're used to,
Yeah,
is what I would say.
Yeah.
love that.
To the point you were saying, you're speaking about Laura about just greeting and the formality and even like extending a handshake too, for example, right? Back home, like there's a certain level of respect to obviously somebody that is older than you back home in Nigeria, like in Nigeria from where I'm from, right? So when I'm doing business with somebody older than me, I'm not gonna see the person the first time and then be extending my hand for a handshake, right? There's a certain level of culture, like in obviously in Africa, there are over 54 countries, right? So there are certain each country has its own approach towards like certain communication styles with like the elders and the likes, right? So if I'm doing business, for example, I'm not to someone that is older than me. I'm not gonna the first thing I'm gonna do is not to extend my hand and ask them for a handshake, right? There's a certain way I would approach that conversation of like showing respect first of all for the person, either through like how I greet the person or how I even just kind of like greet the person, right? So taking that scenario to also kind of bringing it to Canada. I remember when I first of all started having like conversations with like people that were like older than me and the likes, right? And it was like, oh, the way I even just greet them is like, okay, cool. I can call you by your first name. Like I can call you by this. In some places you probably would want to call sir or like, Mr., So there are just several ways of understanding those sort of ways we greet people and even just approach. And like Danny said, like beyond business is like an abstract thing, but beyond anything in business, we are human beings first before we are like talking about businesses, right? So it's about how do we sort of understand the human level first before we even start thinking about it from a place of business too.
I love that. I love that. And I'm glad you mentioned about the respect when addressing someone and formalities and I know in the Spanish language, any kind of Romance language, the way you address someone is really important. So if you had a basic understanding of Spanish, but you didn't address someone like for those that speak Spanish, as usted, instead of like, if you give them like a very familiar, like you're greeting your friend, it's rude and it's like glaringly obvious. But yeah, that's really like you do initially, like you definitely have to show respect. And then we mentioned you're human. Can I call you? But that comes later. But just we're talking about that initial when you're doing your business development. So maybe on that note, I'm just wondering about how do you make those global connections in the first place? So we all probably know about different trade missions and trade shows and B2B matchmaking, but when you're making those global connections in the first place, um, maybe what's your advice for turning a brief intro into maybe a meaningful relationship where you can develop further conversations and not to kind of sabotage that initial introduction? Does anyone have any tips or tricks for founders that are attending? Let's say a founder is attending a trade show, trade mission. What would be some of those that key piece of advice because you meet so many people. So those introductions, I have my own, but Peter, you've got your microphone off, so maybe I'll start with you.
That's fine. So I work obviously in the media entertainment marketing space, right? So for me personally, what I would always say is even when I approach just doing interviews generally, like when I do interviews with like even just talent and the artists, the most important thing is to find a punchline. When I say punchline is something that that wows them, like, oh, I saw you work or I saw you did an interview with this, or I would love to kind of get to know more about something that kind of captures their attention, right? I think that's the first of all, the biggest thing because and I'm talking from a place of using media or using social media. I think the biggest place that we can make global connections right now, like easily, is through social media, either through LinkedIn, either through Instagram. I've had success with using Instagram, LinkedIn. When I got to Canada, actually, my first job in Canada was through a platform called Clubhouse for people who are familiar with Clubhouse back in 2021. But just kind of finding out, like, if you're going to go approach somebody, do your research on the person, try and find out information that you feel like would be valuable enough that you have actually studied or gotten interested in them in the first place, and start that with your conversation, or start your conversation with that, right? So, oh, hey, I saw you saw, or I saw you were in Spain last year. Or how did you find Spain? I'd like to get to know more about, just kind of conversations about that, so that way there's like the icebreaker that is already being done, and at least you know that guaranteed they're going to get a response because not only have you sort of show them that you're interested in business or like you wanted to reach out to them for like business conversation, but like more about like, oh, I want to get to know more about you. I want to get to know you. Like, and I can speak personally for myself. Like a lot of people, when you want to, we are talking about it from a place of business being abstract and humans being the focus of the baseline of businesses, right? So the biggest thing is I want to get to know more about you first than know more about your business. Yes, I'm here for your business. But at the same time, first, like, how do I really kind of get to know you? And I think that way, when you approach people with that lens, it makes people feel more human that, okay, you're not just here to be transactional, even though, yes, that's probably what you're here for, but don't show me, don't be too obvious with that. Like, make it like easy to be able to come up, talk, like, let's have a conversation first before, you know, you go into business, right? So, yeah.
Absolutely. I just saw somebody made a comment, build trust first. Yeah, trust and interest. If they're interested in speaking to you more, like because you're an interesting person, then they're going to want to hear about your business. But if there's no like real connection, like it's built that trust and connection first and yeah, before you dive into your elevator pitch for sure. For sure. Danny, I see that your mic is off.
Yeah, I keep putting it on and off to make sure that there's no background noise. I would say, like, yes, that is definitely trust is the basis of all um, in transactions. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're spending €5 or if you're spending 5 million euros. People buy from people. I would just say on the topic of getting to know the person in front of you, I would say for most cultures it's acceptable, but if I'm thinking about the German speaking market, it's a big no-no to talk about personal, like, do you have kids? Are you married? It would make people very uncomfortable in the first instance. Now you can get away by saying, I'm from Canada and this is what you do. So people are open to that kind of communication, but I would just say just be aware of who's in front of you. And if you're looking to build relationships, maybe start in the governmental programs. There are a lot of great governmental programs that help you build those bridges in the countries that you're trying to access. And I'm thinking of like, especially Europe, maybe for Asian countries, African countries, maybe there's not that much of a stronger government presence, but definitely for European countries and Europe as a whole and Germany specifically, there are organizations from the government that will help you get into the market and that will help you cross those cultural barriers quicker and faster. And some even provide financial assistance to accelerate the relationships. So it's always, I would say, a good start there.
Excellent. I have 2 points, and then Naker will go to you. But that's really interesting. And It's super interesting because I just heard I was on a panel on Tuesday, and for Indonesia, we had a guest speaker from EDC, and he said, if you want to do business in Indonesia, with your counterpart for whatever sector or industry, you better know the names of their children and what they're doing. So you're saying in Germany, I love this because you're saying in Germany, and I'd be the same. I don't want to divulge information on my family. Well, that's not what we're talking about, but it absolutely in certain with certain cultures and in certain industries, countries, it's really important to know that. And the government programs, yeah, very important. We know that for the Canadian SMEs that are on this call, we know about the Trade Commissioner Service and then their programs and also their, the various trade missions that not only federally, like with the Trade Commissioner Service, but provincially, sometimes municipalities have trade missions into a country or receiving, inbound buyers, like different inbound missions. So getting connected with that, but it's really important to do your homework first so that you understand before taking part in one of these trade missions. Because the trade mission at that point, it's kind of to validate your assumptions about the market, your business plan, your strategy for the market, and then you attend a trade show and you're vetting that information, vetting your assumptions, meeting with the trade commissioner, maybe finding out really on the ground what is how is the business culture in this market going to affect my business plan? What do I need to tweak? Yeah, but that was a really good point about these government programs for sure. Nika, did you want to mention something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, just on this question about making the most of your time abroad, I think it's always great to do, and I think it's important for founders to really make the time to do that meaningfully. Part of that is I often tell them is that, 5 meaningful conversations is honestly almost better positioning the company than if we were just to collect like 1,000 business cards, right? So like when you first meet someone, focus less on like what you're trying to do. We kind of talked about this and more about what matters to them. So like doesn't have to get personal all the time. It could also just be like, what priorities are shaping your work or what trends are you looking out for? And then follow up with them, see what adds value to them. Like, is that sharing an article? Is that introducing them to someone you guys spoke about? Is that just simply continuing the conversation you guys had when you were on your trip? That's a great way to also kind of take advantage of your time there. And then also, again, like relationships grow when you feel people are interested, that you're trying to create value and not just simply extracting value from them. And I think that's like ultimately what it is. We talked a lot about that, but that trust feature is certainly a big one. People want to feel like this is a genuine relationship and not just simply a one-way kind of extracting moment.
Absolutely, absolutely. I just wanted to add a couple of things. So often, if people are participating, since we're talking about trade shows or trade missions, if people are participating in a trade mission or a trade show or some event to the country of interest, I always recommend going a couple days early, at least a day early, so you can observe, like, walk the streets, observe the way people dress, observe, like if you're a product, let's say you're a food manufacturer and you go into a market, go to a supermarket, look at, go to your aisle and see how people are like interacting with the products, like what are they purchasing, how long does it take for them to grab that product off the shelf, or and you can think of multiple examples. So go early and understand, and sometimes know enough about the country and little bit, don't talk, I would never recommend talking politics ever, but at least know a little bit about the politics, maybe their sports teams, probably a good topic to know a little bit about is how their football or their soccer team is doing. But anyway, just understand a little bit about their culture, and going a few days in advance is really good to do some recon and just like casual observation and that's primary research. So Yeah, I always suggest that. And I think, Peter, you had mentioned about social media, and I wanted to mention knowing what platforms your business partner is on. So if I was speaking with that EDC's rep in Indonesia, and he was talking about in Indonesia, everybody is on Instagram, and that is the social media platform, and WhatsApp for communication. And I know in Canada it's not as prevalent, but he said that if he has to send an email with a lot of information to a counterpart, he'll send a WhatsApp to say, please check your email. But most communication is via WhatsApp. So understanding understanding what social media platform and what communications platform people use is really important for sure. Yeah. Okay. So what about maintaining relationships? So we do the follow up, and that's important because I think Canadians are, I think Canadians are accused of not doing follow up. I'm generalizing, but maybe not so good with the follow up. So when you're trying to, like, if you've followed up and you're trying to maintain this relationship, it can be tricky with time zones, languages, different cultural expectations. So, what would be your best advice for following up? Say, so Nika, if we have those 5 really good conversations instead of a briefcase full of contact cards or business cards, what would be your best advice for that following up with, say, those 5 or even 2 or 3 key business partners or potential business partners?
Yeah, I think this is where we really focus in on the intentional listening, right? So when we're speaking with somebody, let's really be intentional about what we're hearing from them, and then that way we're able to queue up what that follow-up is. As I mentioned before, is it an article? Is it a contact that they were trying to get in touch with? Was it simply just they were a huge, I don't know, Blue Jays fan, and that's something you want to kind of pick up as just like a genuine, hey, like they had a great game the other day, so this is a great way for me to touch base with you again. So I think like these are really important for us to consider when we're on these trips, to really listen in and hear where our kind of mode of connection can be and then how we can follow up with that. So it's just thinking about it in the time to know to set that up for later. And maybe putting it in your notes on your phone to say, with this person, it's important that these are the things so you can remember it for next time.
Right. And would you ask your counterpart what the best form of communication is? Like, would you ask them, is it email? Is it WhatsApp?
Yeah, I mean, I also think my own default, and this maybe goes back to my own South Asian background, but it's like we're always on the WhatsApp. That's a very common one. But I think generally, most of the time, many of my clients will often say, hey, like just hit me on WhatsApp if it's easier for me or whatever, especially a lot of international clients. So I think that's really helpful to know. Most of them will tell you, but otherwise, keeping it informal, or even sometimes a lot of it is like if I see something that's happening within the government or policy realm, I'm able to then say, hey, like, this might be interesting for you. Happy to jump on a call if this is something you want to talk about in later, or like it kind of impacts your industry that might be helpful for you. So that's another great way to kind of see what's happening in the news or looking at what might be impacting that kind of like supply chain, or if there's anything like that. Super helpful for them.
Right. And what about, before I go to Danny and Peter, what about respecting work hours? Because I know, in North America, there's often, it's a feather in your cap, you're on 24/7, but I don't think every market shares that same, um, you know, where the same enthusiasm for work taking over life. So what about, in your experience, respecting the 9 to 5 and respecting their work time zone?
I mean, I think most people understand that, especially when you're working in a different time zone, that I'm sending work within my time zone. So there's never really been an issue where they're like, this is not within my time zone. Like I've never experienced that personally. But I always say it with a genuine case of like, to me, sometimes something is just simply leaving it on someone's virtual desk, right? Like I've sent you a message. It's not like it needs urgent action, but it's just certainly something that I'm saying, hey, like maybe you want to read this in your spare time or when you're on a flight somewhere. This might be of interest to you, and I'm simply leaving it for your knowledge. That's great to say as well. There's no need for, unless it's like actually urgent, in which I would say, like, hey, I need you to urgently look at this, or this is something we need to jump on a call today about. But ultimately, it's just keeping lines of communication open unless someone has explicitly told me that, this timing didn't work for them. But honestly, a lot of people appreciate oftentimes me working in my off hours so that I'm able to make their time zones and be able to push work forward, especially in Canada. So I think that's really important for us to just keep lines of communication open, understand there's mutual respect, and that, me sending you something doesn't always necessarily mean urgent action, but certainly just being able to leave something for your review later. It's with the purest of intentions to always try to help.
Right. Great answer. Danny and Peter, did you want to add anything to this?
Okay, I could jump in real quick. Again, just following up on the same conversation about being intentional. We've really focused on the idea of building trust, but being intentional in the conversation, being intentional in just kind of checking in, how you check in. The one thing that I would say that came to mind when you were speaking on Neha was, you could send a message to somebody, but it's very important to understand how you communicate in regards to, like, I sent you a text, yes, but like, don't pick up the phone past 5 p.m. and then give me a call to say check, or I sent you a message, can you follow up, or can you see that? Like, if it's not urgent, like you rightly said, there's no really reason for you to be calling people, especially like someone that you're just trying to build a relationship with. Like, you don't pick up the phone and just randomly call somebody at like 9 p.m. If it's 2 p.m. your time, it could be maybe 9 p.m. their time. You should be very aware of that, and then don't just do that, right? So I think that's one of the things I wanted to add. But again, just even in general, like when you see, you've built a relationship with somebody, either through maybe you follow the person on LinkedIn, they announce maybe like a success, they announce maybe like a new job or new position, nothing wrong in sending a message and saying, oh, I saw you posted on LinkedIn about your new job. Congratulations, wish you all the best. That way you stay in touch in the person's mind, and you're being intentional about checking in. Again, the biggest thing again is that we don't always just want to look at an angle of trying to extract value. Really is more about showing yourself, also about like, how do I sort of maintain a relationship with this person first before I start thinking about extracting the value that I eventually want. But first things first, like you rightly said, focus on the relationship, focus on building that trust itself too, right? And then just be careful of, like different, like we mentioned rightly, different cultures have different ways in regards to how they would want to communicate or how they want to be checked on. For example, like, you rightly said, there are some cultures that you don't mix business with personal. You don't want to be asking maybe about family, for example, because then it's like, you don't need to know why you ask about my family, right? So just understanding those cultural nuances and those cultural contexts before, being intentional, but also understanding those cultural contexts.
Excellent. Excellent. Danny, did you want to talk about Germany? I always love hearing specifically
Yeah.
about other markets.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak a lot about Germany, but I would say maybe one thing that I would add is don't overpromise. So I would say in North American culture, at least, I mean, when I say North American, I obviously mean Canada and stuff, is that we tend to be very enthusiastic and be like, oh yeah, let's meet up for coffee. I'd love to catch up, but it's more of like you genuinely mean it, but it's more like a language exchange versus an actual promise, if that makes sense. And so for certain cultures, I think that might be a little overwhelming. So overpromising, maybe don't do that as much. Just kind of keep it a little bit more, stick to what you say you will do. So if I say like, hey, can I reach out via email? Would that be acceptable? And the person says yes, then do that. Don't then send a WhatsApp and send an Instagram invitation and be like, hey, are you still okay with it? Don't go further than what you said you would do. And don't forget to do what you've said, actually, is also very important. So specifically to German culture, That's a big one. If you say you're going to follow up via email, do so. Um, Try not to set yourself in a sticky situation where you say, oh, within the next 6 hours, in 3 minutes, I'll send you the next email. And then, something happens, you get a call live, and then it's 3 hours later. And then Germans are like, oh, she said she would send an email in 5 minutes, but she didn't. So it just going back to that trust thing, right? Do what you say and say what you do.
Love it. Love it. That's very good. Um, So we've raised a lot of great points about building trust and credibility. I'm just wondering, as relationships develop and you're at like when we're thinking of the negotiation stage, what are some of those um, misconceptions or areas which can often trip up individuals like in the negotiation stage where you're trying to create a contract. I can think of my own, like working with the government of Chile and in negotiations with Chile, like maybe doesn't necessarily mean maybe. Maybe it means no, and they just don't want to tell you. And so understanding like their negotiation style or understanding the negotiation style of your counterpart and how, maybe they feel like in certain cultures, they need to save face, for example, and they have to negotiate something better than what's been presented. So knowing that and building that into the proposed contract is really important, because if there is no room, if there are no margins built in there, then you can't negotiate down. So understanding the culture of the person, your counterpart that you're negotiating with, I think is really important. Um, Anybody have any other points that they want to? So we're past the introduction. We've got a relationship. We're down to hopefully getting a contract. And hopefully you've chosen the right counterpart, understanding too that in some markets you may need to work through an agent or a representative, because in certain markets they're not going to work with you directly. They're going to work through a known intermediary. So that's all part of it too, understanding the culture, understanding that, they trust the local representatives or agents that they have long-term relationships with. They're not going to necessarily listen to you unless you go through a local rep, but that's all part of it too. But let's say you found the right market entry, you're negotiating with your counterpart. What are some of those areas um, that might, like nuanced areas that might not be so obvious?
Maybe I can add something.
I see Danny thinking, so I'm going to let you
Yeah.
go.
So I would say, never forget that communication is like 90% you being quiet. So I love to talk. I could talk all day long. I could have monologues with myself. And that's something that it's a skill that I actually had to learn, is to listen, because when you listen, that's when you can hear what they are actually needing and wanting. Um, and that's how you can best then go in and hit hopefully the nail on the head with exactly that. So in that asking questions and letting them speak and trying to understand what it is that they are personally looking for, because at the end of the day, there's always a person who is managing the deal and they have personal investment in it. Like you said, it might just be that internally they have to have a certain margin, 5% that they have to get the client down, or they have to have an extra contract or appendix to whatever. It could also be that they have a personal gain. They want to get to the next step professionally, and they are trying to prove themselves by getting a better deal than what was actually first presented. And that's why I still go to the fact that people buy from people. So really understand the person and the stakeholders that are in front of you, because sometimes there's more than one person involved. And there might be a different person behind the scenes who's actually signing the contract. So stay curious and be quiet as much as possible.
For sure. Knowing who's in the room. Are the decision
Mm,
makers in the room?
yeah,
Are the ones that are in the room taking that information back to to the actual decision maker? Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Nika, I see your mic is
Yeah, I
off.
was just gonna add, even thinking about when we're in actual negotiations or talking with different governments, I think staying flexible with the terms, like you might have a certain vision in your head about what this is gonna look like or what the outcome will be, but sometimes in many relationships, what your ultimate goal is might be like a three-part phase or something. Like you may be at step one, but to get to step three, we have to kind of start at step one, and that's okay too. And looking at things and being able to assess where your expectations are and how you can still get there. It just might not be as quickly as you'd like, but just remaining flexible, I think, is a big part. And like, for example, if they do want to do with local partners, which personally in our line of work, I find a lot of the time it's finding that local connection or local partner, again, takes time. So like being flexible, being open to meeting with new people. And again, that vision you've had in your head, maybe you thought for the first round it would be best for just you and this government to work together, but perhaps it is working with partners at first and then slowly branching off and doing your own thing with them once you've proven yourself over some time. And then, sometimes a deal that you have in your head is not for today, right? It could be something for down the road. So also understanding that, with this particular country you're trying to do business with, it might be that this is an introductory moment, or it could be that you guys are ready to go into the long haul or a long-term commitment. So just again, I would always preface with the idea that don't try to be too rigid or strict in your mind about what this is going to look like, and just remaining open to all possibilities and meeting people and connecting.
Love that. Love that. I have a couple points I wanted to mention here. Peter, did you have anything to add?
No,
If not,
I think me and Danny really covered the base on that. So yeah.
okay. Um, so just on what was said, I think if you're at the stage where you're negotiating a contract, contracts are so important. So it's great to develop these relationships, but at the end of the day, the contract has to be rock solid. So if you're a product manufacturer, product exporter, and you're going into a market and you're negotiating price and who's going to ship the product and who's going to pay and who's going to clear through customs. My biggest tip, my biggest piece of advice, um, use Incoterms. Like, please do not sign or create a contract that doesn't include the proper Incoterm, because you could say that you're going to ship it and pay for the shipping, and then they're going to clear through customs. But if you actually use the wrong Incoterm, guess what? You actually can be accountable if something happens. So if you don't know what Incoterms are, we do not have enough time today, but understand what Incoterms are, because that three-letter acronym can spell out a whole huge contract. So understanding what Incoterms are, how to choose the right Incoterm for your particular shipment and your particular product is paramount, and it can avoid so many problems, even with the best partner, even with that best buyer. You've landed a retail contract, whatever that might be, even the best relationship with that you've built on trust, you developed for 2 years. If you don't use the right Incoterm or have the proper clauses in your contract, things can fall apart after the first shipment if something goes wrong. So that is my biggest piece of advice. I'm looking at the time. Wow, I feel like we could talk for another hour, but I do see that we have some questions that have come in. So let us dive in to the Q&A. Thank you everyone for adding your questions. Um, So we have a question from Eva. Do Europeans like to connect over LinkedIn or do they prefer emails or something else? Danny?
Yeah, sure. I can do. So LinkedIn, definitely a basis for connection. I would say don't phone them is the first thing I would say. Don't pick up the phone. Not a cool thing to do, especially not in Germany. But the same goes for France, Denmark, all of that. Um, I would say email, LinkedIn is always acceptable. If you reach out via LinkedIn, write a little note. Say, I'm reaching out because of, or I know this person and they said to reach out to you. So don't just random reach out because the Europeans are very sensitive about data and they're very aware of data breaches and very educated in that sense of being careful online and all of that. So add that personal touch that like, I'm not a bot. I am a human being behind this profile. And if you can add that personal touch of I'm reaching out to you because I'm interested in XYZ of your business, then it's certainly helpful. So email, LinkedIn, absolutely acceptable.
I love that. I think that's the same can be applied to North America too and Canada. I get a lot of requests, connection requests, but if they don't send me a note, I'm just skeptical that they're going to try to sell to me. Like they just want to connect so that they can sell to me. So I would just say always leave a note, always, how you saw them in the first place. Oh, I saw you on a panel. Okay, that's great. Then just sending a connection request. Yeah, that's a great point. We have Astic is asking, is there any financing available for international traders from banks or any other organization for international traders? So, Astic, are you a trader? Like, are you importing into Canada or are you exporting to other countries? So if you can maybe answer that, because if you were exporting a Canadian product to an international market, there is financing available through export credit agencies like EDC, Export Development Canada, they work with your bank. But on the importing side, the same kind of financing is not available. There would be financing from the country, I'd imagine, or your relationships with your personal bank. So if you can fill us in, that would be helpful. Here's an anonymous question. How do you discover what platforms are the best for communication? Like WhatsApp in Europe or Instagram in Indonesia? Not international, but I have been advised to go through Facebook for Canadian territories. That's interesting. So how do you discover what platforms? So there's lots of there. I'm going to answer first stab at answering this, but then feel free, panel, to add as well. So if you're at the stage where you're really looking at, you have an opportunity in the market, you've done your research, you've created a market entry plan or an export plan. At that point, if you've done your homework, reach out to, if you're a Canadian company, reach out to the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service in market and find out. I'm sure they've published, a commercial guide, a guide to doing business in that market. Probably one for your industry as well, or potentially one for your industry as well. And that's the type of information that you could ask them, like, what is if you can't see it in those guides that have, in those reports that have been prepared, like what would be the normal in this industry? What would be the normal way of communicating with businesses in this market? I find that that's really helpful because they're on the ground. They know the standard norms and practices and preferences in the market. So that would be my suggestion. But there's with AI, there is so much information out there. Every government publishes commercial guides to doing business in X country. So there's a lot of information that's available at your fingertips. So start with that. And then when you want to vet that, you could go through, say, the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service or Export Development Canada too. They have representatives on the ground. And then sometimes to really find out what's happening, you've got to hop on a plane or and travel to the country to really get a feel for how business is done. Peter, Danny, Nika, anything to add there?
I would say it's never a bad starting point to send an email. I think email is the international language of business. They won't necessarily respond, but I think if you send them a Facebook message request, it might not be the same level of communication that you would expect in a business setting. So I would say when in doubt, an email is always your first choice while you're still doing your research or building that intel.
I think also just like looking at how they communicate, right? When I think about politicians who have worked for, like, you see politicians, certain ones love to be on Instagram, for example. Like, so you can tell they're really engaging on that platform. So meeting people where they are. If you see them on LinkedIn a lot, they're posting a lot on LinkedIn, they're sharing articles on LinkedIn. My guess would be that LinkedIn is probably a great place to start that communication. So just seeing where they are, meeting them where they are, and yeah, I agree with Danny on email. I think is always a great if you're just hitting with a cold email, I think that helps, but no expectations, no one's hands are tied. But I think it's
Mm,
great to have and always a great way to touch base.
And for social media, for social platform, I think obviously LinkedIn will probably be like a more preferred option. You rather send somebody a message on LinkedIn saying, for example, oh, I met you at an event, rather than sending an Instagram saying I met you at an event, right? But based on what Neha said, like there are some politicians that could maybe use Instagram as their 4 point place or like of contact. But I think most business owners or most people that you maybe meet in a panel, like in a more formal setting or like formal business conversation. The if email isn't an approach, you probably want to take the next step forward to say, I want to connect this person on a social media platform. LinkedIn should obviously be like the first point of contact than thinking of sending a Facebook message, for example, or like even getting maybe you got my number from somewhere and you send me a message on WhatsApp. Like WhatsApp might not be the best option. Just LinkedIn or email might be the better approach.
Yeah, I'm skeptical about giving out my cell number. I actually I don't like it. So
mm.
yeah, but those are good points for sure. We have a question here about when is traveling in person internationally a smart investment for networking? So I think you can do so. I want to back this question up a bit first. Um, Often what's overlooked is the networking that can take place in Canada. So Canada has so many chambers of commerce, like bilateral chambers of commerce and regional chambers of commerce. So you can do a lot of networking in Canada first, develop some relationships, and then if you're so yeah, there's a chamber of commerce for many countries. So I would do a little bit of research there. Different industry associations sometimes have international companies that are part of that industry association in Canada. So there's a lot you can do here. Don't forget the consulates, trade commissions, embassies. So if you're interested in a particular market, get connected with the trade commission, especially for technology companies, companies that are looking to form maybe more of a strategic alliance. So the trade commissions are always looking for businesses so that if they have inbound trade missions, that they can connect, similar companies that have, that would be able to collaborate with their technology or their service. So don't overlook those. But I think when you go internationally, the, basically, if you're going to go on a trade mission, go to a trade show, I always say it's a marathon and just network until you're exhausted at night, because so many, my best contacts were made not during the trade show itself, but in the after party or in the lineup to get coffee, and you're just standing there. And those were my best contacts. So just be open, be engaged, as Danny said, be a good listener, be engaged, and show your human side, and go to as many networking events as you can. And I always think it's a smart investment. So, anybody have anything else to add on that question?
Yeah, I was gonna say that I think another
Uh,
great, to your point, just to add, Laura, is like, speaking of the Canada options, like obviously Mark Carney is doing his first ever investment summit that's happening in Toronto. That's a great way you can kind of know that they're all coming, I think, in the fall. So it's a great way for you to go to Toronto and maybe just not necessarily get into the investment summit, because I think they're looking for much larger investments. But I think seeing the business that's going to be happening in and around there, doing side events with other partners that might be in town, is a great way for you to kind of get double bang for your buck. But also, looking at, I mean, Wellington obviously puts on a lot of these types of side events at big major global moments. So certainly knowing what those are, figuring out the time slots for them, maybe looking into or doing a bit of a mapping around what events would make sense for whatever company you're trying to do, and thinking through who would be those people you'd want to engage with, and then going there and making the time and maybe building the plan to what you said also, Laura, before, like the day before, the day after generally are good times for you to kind of see who's there, engage with people that might be coming from other places around the world, and utilizing that time. That's in the off hours of the formal programming.
Yeah, for sure. And I always say that for trade shows, instead of investing in a trade show for the first time, they're huge investments. I know that. Um, I would say if there was a prominent trade show for your particular industry, which was relevant for the market that you wanted to enter into, the country, I would say visit. Go to the trade show as a visitor, get a feel for the room, get a feel for who's there, who's visiting the booths, like who's exhibiting. Maybe if all of your competitors are there, um, you might want to go the following year, or you get a feel that the buyers are going to be there, or different similar companies to yours that are looking to partner. So I would say, without making that huge investment for the first time, hop on a plane if the trade show is overseas, and just visit. Just get a hotel room one night and just visit the show. You'll learn so much by doing that primary research and getting a feel for it yourself. So that would be my tip on, is it worth the ROI? Well, do your homework first to make sure that you've identified the correct trade show before you make that investment. And then once you do make that investment for that trade show, trade mission, then you just treat networking as a marathon, and or an Ironman, and you just keep going to the finish line. Yeah. Okay, so we've got a question here from Julie. How do diaspora communities contribute to building relationships and trust that facilitate business engagement in foreign markets? In your view, this is a great question. In your view, what factors explain why some diaspora communities have been more successful than others in promoting trade, investment, and international business partnerships? That is a fantastic question. Thank you for asking that, because I talk about that all the time. But Nika, I see you shaking your head. Did you want to take a first answer for
Well,
this?
yes, it's such a great question, and I agree. This has been such a topic. I was instrumental in a large part of it, the Canada Africa, partnership that the Canadian government has done, and a large part of that was really driven by the diaspora here in Canada to do better, engagement with Africa, and how that connection and that relationship needs to be fostered was really led and driven by the diaspora here, and I'm sure, there's so many examples I can use of that. I think that's a very powerful tool. I think even just making the business case for that, a lot of money goes out of our country to their country through remittances and others. Like people are obviously helping and supporting families abroad, even though they might be living here in Canada. Like our worlds are so intertwined. I know we all know these kinds of things. So I think it's very, very important to continue to touch base with community. I think honestly, best ideas always come from community. Peter knows this, but probably better than anybody here. But I'll pass it over to him. But I think, that is such a beautiful thing. I think also like community wants to hear from us too. Like how can they get involved? Where can they lend their voice to something? How do they kind of fit into the system? And again, they're like obviously helpful and able and obviously drive a lot of business as well, right? A lot of successful businesses here in Canada are run by people from the community. So that's certainly much respect to them and their hard work. So I think that's probably the one of my most things I love about my work, and I certainly love to do and continue to do. But I'll pass it on to Peter since this is his expertise.
Thank you so much. Like I said, amazing, amazing question. I think the biggest thing about diaspora communities is they understand both worlds, right? So speaking for myself, um, I'm Nigerian by birth. I moved into Canada in 2021. But prior to coming to Canada, I had lived in Nigeria most of my entire life. Now I'm in Canada 2021. I'm now a Canadian citizen, and I also now understand the community or like the wellness, the ecosystem of Canada. Now, with me being able to understand this like both worlds, I've been able to bring a business into Canada that sort of creates a balance for both. Now, what this business does is it creates opportunities not only just for African diaspora communities, but it also creates opportunities for like the ecosystem around that. So to the point that Omnia mentioned is like these communities are able to support businesses, while also able to sort of contribute back to the ecosystem, back to the community itself, that not only just for the diaspora community, but also the community at large. Um, with the festivals in general, like we have sponsors that range from just general merchandise businesses to different vendors coming to the festival. And that way there's a sense of, just kind of creating that platform or that sense of belonging for just not only ourselves, but the community at large, right? So there's definitely that opportunity or there's the contribution of the diaspora community towards just the wider ecosystem of what we bring into like the ecosystem of Canada itself when it comes to business.
Excellent. Excellent. Danny, did you have something to add here?
Yeah, I can just add from the other perspective of coming to Germany. I think when you come into a foreign country with a foreign language, oftentimes you tend to look for things that are familiar. And familiarity is what you already know. So you look for those traditions and those foods and those cultural norms that you're used to. So you tend to build a community within a community while you are still navigating the new country that you're living in. At least I can only speak for myself. That I mean, I was looking for Canadians for the longest time in Germany, and there are not that many out there. So it was a bit disorientating. But I think because of that, you just generally tend to be a little bit more open to new connections and businesses and business ideas because you know what it feels like. You know what it feels like to be the odd one out, so to speak, or the one who doesn't fit whatever standard that is, and whether in both ways, so being a Canadian abroad or being a foreigner into Canada. But I think that's what is one of the most Canadian strengths is our multiculturalism. And that's what I missed a lot when I came to Europe is just the fact that people are different and it's acceptable to be different and it's actually welcomed. And that we can all be different but still build great relationships.
Love that. Well said.
Yeah.
Well said. We have a question here. Peter, this is for you. What are the organizations in Canada that drive the Can-African trade relationship?
Family habits about two. So there's the Canadian Council on Africa. I know that there are several Canadian Chamber of Commerce's or local Chamber of Commerce's that I know that local African countries have started. And then, generally speaking, I think the best source that I know really is just African embassies and high commissions, right? So I know that there's the Nigerian embassy in Ottawa. When it comes to several, negotiations with like obviously people trying to do businesses in just even just general welfare of Nigerians in Canada, the embassy is always a first good resource to be able to look at. And I also know that depending on the city you are in, there are several organizations that sort of support this sort of trade or this sort of conversations when it comes to like um brokering businesses and the likes, right? But I think the first two that come to mind is the Canadian Council on Africa, and then obviously like the African High Commissions, if you can reach out to any of them.
Excellent. And then don't forget Global Affairs Canada and the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service who have offices throughout various countries around the globe, including Africa. So make sure you check that as well.
Also,
Neha, did you have something else to
yeah,
add?
I was just gonna add also, yes, global affairs, of course, that's the first thing that always comes to my mind. But of course, also Africa Trade Desk is a great resource as well. If you haven't figured that website out, I can put it in the chat for people. But Africa Trade Desk is a great organization too.
Excellent. Thank you. We have 5 minutes left, so I'm sorry I have to prioritize some questions. We have here, wow, this one could go on for maybe half an hour. Any comments on negotiating in China or other Asian markets when you are not receiving any concessions and they are continually asking questions and waiting for more from you? Does anybody have any advice or an answer to that question? I would say that it is very tricky. I would say sometimes I'm going to go but revert back to my previous comment about having an agent or having a representative and maybe of um, Asian descent in the particular market you're trying to go into, because then they may be better negotiators and better able to either push back on some of the concessions that they're asking for. So that would be my piece of advice around that.
I
Anybody
can
have
speak
any
only
other?
for the pharma industry really quickly. I would
Yeah,
say it's nearly impossible in China to do business without a Chinese partner. I'm not saying it hasn't been done. I'm just saying
excellent.
that's usually how it works. You first find a Chinese partner that you then um, bring into your organization, and then you have a Chinese partner. So for China specifically, so that's a very specific market, I would say, to do business in.
Yeah,
And
excellent.
Asia as a whole, it's such cultural
Yes.
differences. It's so hard to put everything into Asia. But because
Yeah.
China was
Yes.
mentioned, I thought I would add that. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, for sure. We have time for probably one more question, Amanda. I'm going to ask one more,
Yep,
and
no
then I'll pass it
problem.
over to you.
No problem.
Um, Let me see. So there's one here about why is Germany's interest. So they're asking about how do you find out what countries are interested in their particular industry? They don't want to waste time networking in regions that are not, where the opportunity isn't present for their company. So I would say that that's where you need to spend your time. This is where you need to do your due diligence. This is
Yeah.
all about doing that real market research that's going to help you determine your target market. And I always caution companies, your target market should only be like one or two. Don't try to go into Europe because we know how many markets are in Europe. So do your research, do your due diligence. There's tons of information, secondary information out there. find out which market has the most potential for your particular organization, because it's not just the industry, but what stage are you at? Is your organization at? Are you really ready to export? There's so much there to unpack. We have a great course called Feasibility of International Trade. So where it runs through with if you're really ready to enter into a particular market, is it feasible for you to do so? Cost analysis, there's so much there. But um, I'm just wondering, so Danny, why is Germany's interest in Canadian health science so strong? There's a question that I thought was a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes boils down to what is Germany's strength. So because in Germany there are no resources, there's no petrol, there's no mines, there's no coal, there's none of all of these raw materials. So people are invested in education, and that's what they are focusing on. So a lot of big schools, education is free in Germany, or very, very, very cheap. So
Wow.
people are highly educated and they invest a lot in education, and that's what their strength is. And because of that, they've built really strong pillars in engineering and in research. So clinical research, there's a lot of research organizations also funded by the European government. So there are large labs. The university clinics are quite large. They don't just welcome patients, they also do those preliminary research. So I would say that's, you know, certain things always make money. Drugs is one of them, food. So these are all things that will always be needed, regardless of the turmoil that is happening around us, unfortunately.
Excellent answer. Excellent. Well, we're out of time. Amanda, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Laura. Cannot thank you enough for moderating this conversation. It was absolutely excellent. I personally learned a lot, so this was fantastic. Thank you so much to our audience for joining today's event. A quick feedback poll is going to pop up on your screen today so we can learn how your experience was, and you can provide us some feedback on maybe some future topics that you would like to see webinars on. Of course, I would love to thank once again our moderator, Laura, and our wonderful speakers, Neha, Peter, and Danny. Thank you so much for donating your time and your expertise. We packed quite a lot into just an hour and a half. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you again to our co-presenting partners, UPS and EDC, as well as our ecosystem partner, Forum for International Trade, and our community partners, GS1, Communitech, and WeBC. Our next Startup Global event is taking place on July 30th. It is an industry roundtable on manufacturing and clean tech. So we'll be dropping the link to register for that in the chat. And so make sure you register if you're interested in attending. Otherwise, please complete the poll on your screen. And thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, Amanda, Startup, and everyone.